Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, friends of the Bruno Kreisky Forum in Austria and abroad. I'm very happy to hosting this conversation in the framework of our Hegemonies and Alliances program that my dear colleague Walter Posch from the Austrian Institute for Peace Support and Conflict Management. And we are very lucky today to have a distinguished guest as Walter's partner in conversation, Henri Barkey, adjunct senior fellow of the Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Bernhard L. and Bertha F. Cohen Chair in International Relations at Lehigh University. I am very, very pleased, and thank you so much, Henri, that you join us for this conversation on the topic after the US elections, the perspectives of the Biden administration in foreign policy concerns, with a specific focus on Turkey, NATO, and the Middle East region. I'm very grateful that to have both of you in this conversation, and I hand the floor over to Walter and Henri. Thank you very much.
Yeah, welcome everybody. I think there's not much to say about the eminent scholar Henri Barkey, who grew up in Istanbul, and as a student I remember one of the first key books on the Kurdish issue I read was that I read his articles very attentively, and years later I had the honor to meet him in person here in Vienna. And what we would like to do is that Henri gives us an introduction, his take of the new Biden administration's Middle East policy with a certain focus on Turkey, and then we will start a bilateral discussion. Thank you so much for watching. Henri.
Walter, thank you very much, and Gertrude, thank you very much for inviting me to this forum. I wish we didn't have COVID and we could have done it in person, but such is life. So what I will do is talk a little bit about the incoming Biden administration. We don't know much about it, so I'm not going to speculate too much, and then kind of focus a little bit about the challenges that the United States faces, especially with Turkey in the Middle East, but also within NATO. So, you know, the Biden administration was elected, and to the great relief of, I'm sure, many people in Europe, and most people are focusing these days on what the Biden administration will do with Iran, the famous Iran deal, and of course the return to international institutions, organizations that outgoing President Trump had pulled out of, and of course everybody also is expecting a major change in tone coming from Washington. And I think Denmark can be happy to hear that the United States is not going to buy Greenland anymore from Denmark. But so in addition to the change in tone, right, President Trump has always attacked the Europeans for not doing enough. He clearly didn't care much about alliances, and not much, even less probably about NATO. But, you know, when you look at the Biden administration, now we've seen some of the people who have been appointed, they're all essentially centrists. Biden himself is a centrist, somebody who believes in international institutions, somebody who believes in international cooperation. And that has been really his life, in terms of foreign policy. I think the big issue here is, until now, in the last 4 years, we really did not have a foreign policy that was based on on a vision, on an approach, on an ideology. Yes, Trump talked about America first, but in reality, American foreign policy was kind of episodic, going from one issue to another, and mostly to satisfy the president's own ego and personalistic ambitions. I mean, from the failures in North Korea to even the Abraham agreements that are genuinely a success, but could have come anyway without Trump. Nonetheless, these were all essentially designed to make Trump look good rather than part of a kind of long-term American foreign policy. And in fact, the big issue that confronts the Biden administration is what vision is it going to push? What vision is it going to adopt? And here, the great discussion, of course, in think tanks and academics is whether or not there will be a return to the liberal international order that the United States, since the Cold War, had pushed. And I will suggest that, yes, the chances are that we will see certainly a shift towards that, but exactly what shape or form it will take, we do not know. I mean, there is not that much that has been really said about this by the new Biden team. And of course, this is an issue that really they need to do some thinking about. They need to articulate some principles, which they haven't. I mean, we know that there will be more emphasis, and Secretary of State designate Anthony Blinken has made a point of it, that democracy is an important issue, because he also is saying, he said it before the elections, and in contrast to Trump's policies, which basically was a policy that was closer to authoritarian leaders and dismissing kind of the democratic allies of the United States. I mean, he seemed to get along with the likes of Putin, Xi initially, although not after COVID, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, populist authoritarians generally, or authoritarians simply. But the one important message that we got before the elections was the importance of democracy. But again, this is a big idea. We can say, every American administration until Trump emphasized democracy, but then when it came to this application, it's completely a different story. And here, this is what I would like to suggest. Any administration coming to power, especially at this time in global history, is going to be confronted with a whole series of crises or serious issues, right? And there will be obviously governments that will basically try to test the new administration's guardrails and see how far they can push the new administration. And the challenges will come obviously not just from Russia and China, but also from a myriad of other countries. So when I think when you come to power, one of the things that you will immediately be confronted with is a series of issues, some of which are leftovers from the previous administration, some of which are going to be new. And the new administration will essentially start dealing with them. And so this idea of a return to a liberal international order is not something that will be front and center at the beginning. So what I would like to do is kind of look at some of the, shall we say, issues that the new administration will face, and I think Turkey among them is one of the most important ones. But and we can talk about the JCPOA later, because there are significant shifts in the Middle East, strategic shifts that we have seen, not just in terms of the alignment between Gulf states and Israel, but also the Gulf states' new attitude to other developments. Turkey, there are bilateral issues, which I'll talk about in a minute, but Turkey is also a major problem now for the NATO alliance, because in addition to Poland and Hungary, we see the rise of authoritarian leaders. And I was looking at the NATO Charter, and one of the things that the NATO Charter says is, in the preamble of the NATO Charter, it talks about the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and all of these things obviously are eroding very, very quickly in these three countries. And this is a challenge to NATO. And the challenge to NATO is also coming from the behavior of some of these countries, but how they act within the NATO confines. But we saw last year, approximately a year ago, from President Macron of France basically saying that NATO was dead, brain dead, I'm sorry, that he was not just attacking President Trump, but also criticizing President Obama for focusing too much on the Pacific at the expense of the NATO alliance. Obviously, he criticized Trump for moving away from the alliance system. But the issue that had driven him to saying that was the Turkish intervention into Syria against the Kurds. Not only was he upset about that very fact, but it was also the fact that here is a NATO country engaging in a military operation in which other NATO countries have troops and interests, and there was absolutely no coordination, as if the NATO alliance did not really matter to the Turks. And this is what kind of prompted President Macron to kind of raise the alarm. And as a result of this, we have seen essentially a major change in French behavior, where France now has taken a much more important role in Eastern Mediterranean and the Mediterranean, both on the issue of Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus, as well as Libya. And we almost had a confrontation between a French war and a Turkish two frigates some months ago, which was actually pretty dangerous because it could have led to a firefight. So there are major problems within NATO that have to be addressed. And these are things that the Trump administration had not been paying much attention to. And clearly, the Biden administration has to make overture and kind of think about NATO and its role and these problems that are growing within the organization. Now, let me kind of focus on Turkey. Turkey is interesting in many different respects. One is, between Turkey and the United States, you have a number of major issues, and I'll deal with some of them in greater detail. The first one, of course, is Turkish purchase of S-400 missiles, anti-aircraft missiles from Russia. There is the question, of course, of northern Syria and Turkish intervention against the Kurds, who had been fighting with us and the Western Alliance against the Islamic State. There is the issue of Turkish push in the Eastern Mediterranean against Greece and Cyprus. The Turks now claim a vast section of the Eastern Med as their own exclusive economic zone, and completely ignore other countries' rights in this. There is, of course, the question of Turkish intervention in Libya, the Caucasus. There's a specific problem between the United States and Turkey about a bank that was involved in breaking sanctions that the United States has found guilty and is about to impose sanctions. And there's also, of course, discussion of sanctions against Turkey in the US Congress. So this is a very heavy agenda for any government coming to the United States government coming to power. Which of these issues are you going to deal with? And I should add that one of the real big problems, and that kind of gets lost a little bit because of all these other foreign policy issues, is what's happening domestically in Turkey, where Erdogan has completely changed Turkish institutions. He has made it into a one-man system. But not only is he going against all kinds of opponents. I mean, I was looking at numbers. I mean, 64,000 people have been charged for insulting the president in the last 5 years. I mean, think of what kind of atmosphere you must be living in if any time you say something, you can be charged for insulting the president and found guilty. But more importantly than that is, I think, what Erdogan is doing to the Kurds in Turkey. He is completely delegitimizing them. He had actually at one point, to his great credit, sought to solve the Kurdish problem in Turkey by talking to the Kurds. A Kurdish political party emerged and is now the third largest party in the Turkish parliament. And what is clear is that Erdogan is about to close that party. I mean, he is sacking all their municipal leaders, all their mayors who were all elected in democratic elections. He has the leader of the party, the two leaders of the party, in jail now for 4 years. And to me, what is very worrying is the delegitimization of the Kurdish language. That people used to publish in Kurdish, now they're not being allowed. And it's really a return to the 1930s when you were not allowed to speak Kurdish. Kurdish was an unrecognized language. I mean, this is the language of maybe 50 million people in the region, if not more. And the Turkish state is now saying this language doesn't exist. Kurds do not exist. I mean, this is going back to the 1930s. And I think this is worrisome because it may end up, destabilizing Turkey, because most of Turkey's problems today can be attributed a little bit to the Kurdish question. But I've listed all these problems, and I'll focus on one or two, and we have a time issue. But here's what is also very important, kind of the overarching picture of Turkish behavior. I think we will see a debate in Washington between those who want to accommodate Turkey. I mean, this is a perennial debate between those who want to accommodate Turkey because Turkey is a NATO member, Turkey is important, we have military bases in Turkey, we have listening bases in Turkey, and we have to somehow get along. And you already started seeing op-eds emerging on this issue, how important the Turks are, we shouldn't push them very hard, and so on and so forth. And there was another faction that will suggest that maybe not exactly in these terms, but that Turkey has become a revisionist power, that Turkey is trying to change the order in the region and is trying to establish itself as a hegemonic, a local hegemon, if you want. And this is something, by the way, that Erdogan had telegraphed almost from the beginning of when he came to power, that he thought that the international system was unjust because it was based on five permanent members of UN Security Council, and that he thought that countries like Turkey should have a role in deciding the world order, and he saw himself and Turkey as a leader of the Muslim world, in part because of Turkish dynamic industry, Turkish military power, Turkish alliances, the European project, obviously, of Turkey at the time. And now what you've seen in the last decade or so is a policy by Erdogan to push and continuously push its allies, its adversaries in the region. And Erdogan pushes until he gets stopped. And I would say for the last maybe half decade, if not more, there really has not been a pushback against Turkey. So he has gotten away with a whole series of things because of this argument. Turkey is too important and should not be alienated. And therefore, Turkey gets away with a whole series of things. I mean, I'll just just one little example. I mean, 3 members of the American diplomatic staff in Turkey, admittedly 3 Turks. These are people that the U.S. Embassy uses to do translation, to do liaison. 3 of them were arrested and put in jail. One has been released, and the U.S. government has been unable to say to the Turks, these are our folks, right? And when Erdogan sees that the United States essentially has been powerless in terms of pushing back, he pushes further. And I want to use here the S-400 crisis as an emblematic one, because the S-400 crisis is probably one of the first ones that the Biden administration will be confronted with. Why? So the Turks bought S-400 missiles from Russia. Why they did it is, to me, a little bit of a question mark. I don't understand why they did it. The only hypothesis I have is that after the coup attempt in 2016, where supposedly Turkish Air Force jets bombed certain parts of Ankara, including the parliament building, I think Erdogan and his cadres have decided that the Gülen movement, to whom he attributes the coup attempt, was in cahoots with the Americans, and that the Americans probably helped the coup attempt. So there is this deep, should we say, distrust of the United States. That distrust always existed, but after 2016, it has become, has reached levels of almost paranoia. Yet, Erdogan has to obviously work with the United States. The United States is the largest power in the world. It's the leader of the NATO alliance. But there is this huge anti-Americanism that is being propagated by the government, while at the same time, Erdogan supposedly has tried to work with both Trump and now we want to work with Biden. But let me go back to the S-400s. When the Turks said that they were thinking about buying the S-400s, the United States and NATO said, look, you can't do that, because the moment you bring Russian systems, you will be compromising the F-35, the top of the line, the newest fighter aircraft program. Yes, it is mostly an American design, but it is the first time we actually have seen a military program initiated by the United States that has involved so many NATO members, where different NATO countries will be participating in the production of the F-35. And in fact, the Turks got a big chunk of that contract. So not only they're producing parts of the fuselage of the aircraft, but a lot of the servicing of F-35s in Europe would have taken place in Turkey. So the Americans said, look, you can't buy, because that you will expose the stealth secrets of the F-35 to the Russians. Right? And if you do that, we will have to kick you out of the F-35 program, deny you the F-35, and take away the production facility. This was very clearly told to the Turks. And yet, they did it anyway. And now, so the United States was forced to kick the Turks out of the F-35s, right? Fortunately for the United States, no F-35s had been transferred to Turkey. And the ones that the Turkish pilots were training on were reassigned to the American Air Force. And more importantly for the Turks, they lost this capability of building parts of the F-35 and in the process make billions of dollars in export revenue. So this is a huge loss for Turkey. And Erdogan did it. And my take on this, and it's kind of emblematic of everything else, is that I think he thought he could get away with it, that eventually the Turks, I'm sorry, the Americans and NATO countries would say, okay, you know, we'll figure out, you'll get the F-35s, or we won't kick you out of the F-35 program, and we'll find a solution, right? The S-400s are in Turkey. The Turks have yet to deploy them, but they've tested them, right? They are now in a bind because if they do deploy them, it's a real kind of slap in the face of NATO and the United States. So they're still in kind of the radar, at least, of the system is still in boxes. So maybe Trump would have pushed for a solution. In fact, the US Congress passed last year a resolution asking Trump to sanction Turkey for doing this. Trump refused to do it, but the new National Defense Authorization Act has an amendment that says that the President of the United States has to impose sanctions on Turkey. So the mood in the United States has really turned against Turkey, both in public opinion and in Congress. And it has to do, of course, not just with these problems that the United States and Turkey have, or the Turkish actions in Eastern Mediterranean against Greece and Cyprus, but also the authoritarianism of Erdogan. And just to finish this, I mean, today, when you read any American journal or newspaper, and when they talk about the authoritarian leaders of the world, they always mention three leaders together: Xi of China, Putin of Russia, and Erdogan of Turkey. So in terms of the American, shall we say, conception of Turkey, it is now led by an authoritarian leader. And so that it's going to be very difficult, I think, for the Biden administration to kind of go back to the old, shall we say, policy on Turkey. They're far too important. We shouldn't alienate them. We should accommodate them. And let me stop here. And
yeah, thank you very much. I would like to start with two complexes. First, a little bit to ask you something about the S-400 issue again, because I would have some comments on that. And then I would like that you walk us through a little bit to the transformation of Mr. Erdogan before we touch all the other issues, because for once, he was a harbinger of a new generation, and we were very hopeful. So I think we must not take him as perhaps this was always his tendency, but we have to go back to this. Now to the S-400. There are some puzzling details, which I think you hinted at when you mentioned that the radars are still in the boxes, they are not fully deployed, and so on. And one question for me would be, given the fact that from the side of Russia, this is not a trust-based relationship, why should they sell the Turks their absolute best top-notch models? They know when they sell anything to Iran, that won't leave Iran. But that's another issue. Iran has no good relations with the US. It has, and even the Iranians have got these old, or rather older S-300s. So, but they are not afraid that there's a transfer there. But sending it to Turkey, would this mean in all earnest that the Russians would hand over the keys to their top-notch technology to the Turks? Or would it be something which we saw in the 60s and 70s when the Turkish army was just modernizing, where you would have the radar engineers and the crews of the missiles being British or Americans, which were deployed back then in the 60s and 70s? You remember the wave of terrorism in the 1970s was directed against radar engineers in Unye and elsewhere. So I'm wondering all the time, do you know more about what kind of quality the Turks received from the S-400? And I'm asking this because the combination of a NATO standard army with Soviet Russian-made technology is difficult per se. You need a lot of energy. Now, the Iranians haven't managed this entirely after 40 years. You know, after the fall of the Shah, they bought a lot of Russian hardware. But basically, the Iranians have to decide using their missiles for air defense or sending the fighter jets. Now, if you have modern air defense, you have the fighter jets in the air and the missiles in the air. So there's something which has never been debated, and it's either solved already, which would come as a surprise. But in combination with all the other questions, I'm really wondering whether this, the whole buying of it was nothing more than a political act. On the other hand, I totally agree with you that you cannot have in a country even thinking of buying, let alone deploying S-400s and having facilities where you build F-35s. This is just, it goes beyond explanation that you cannot do it. So, and since this was such a blunder from the diplomatic political side, and I agree with you 100%. I think that also that Erdogan thought he can get away. Why? Perhaps he didn't take it all too seriously. He doesn't really like the army, with all the blah, blah, the bluster notwithstanding, but he's not a fan of the army. Just look how he treats the presidential guard, where he was always more on the side of the police. He keeps the army busy. Look at Admiral Yaiji, the hero of Libya, who immediately got sacked when he returned. There's no heroic welcome for any general coming from Syria or Iraq or so. It's quite a strange relationship. So if this assessment is right, then it would be much more serious, because it would reveal Erdogan as a much bigger and a much more irresponsible gambler, rather as a gambler than an audacious politician. So that was a lot of questions and comments. Let me hand it back to you.
Look, this is interesting. Let me, I don't exactly know where to start, but let me just start with the notion of the S-400 staying in Turkey and a return of the Turks to the F-35 program. The problem is that now there is absolutely no trust on this issue, between the Americans and the Turks. This is not to say that the Americans and Turks don't talk to each other. They talk to each other all the time through all different kind of channels, right? And military, diplomatic, etc. I mean, these are two countries that have been allies for a very long time. But fundamentally, Turkey is not going to be allowed to go back to the F-35 program, because you cannot trust Erdogan if he says to you, oh yes, I bought the S-400s, but they're going to stay forever in the cases, and I'm never going to use them, and I'm never going to deploy them. And so the United States will bring back the Turks in and give them the F-35s, and suddenly Erdogan will decide, oh, you know what, I think I should use the S-400s. This is too big of a risk for the United States to take. Yes. Maybe 15, 20 years from now, when the F-35 is already kind of a has-been aircraft and there's something else that's coming down the pike, maybe then. But I don't see in the near future how this problem is going to be solved. Why buy it from Russia? What you said is absolutely correct. I think it was part of a demonstration of Turkey is independent. Turkey, yes, is a member of NATO. Turkey is an ally of the United States, but Turkey can do whatever it wants. Right? Turkey is a big power, and if it's going to impress the region, right, the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East, that you have to take Turkey seriously, is by showing that Turkey can stand up to the United States. Right? So buying the S-400s was really an act of, in some way, standing up against the United States. It was a message, not necessarily to the US, a message to a message east, if you want. Now, is it possible, as you implied, that the agreement between Erdogan and Putin is a political one, in the sense that maybe Putin forced him to buy it? You remember the Russians, the Turks had in 2015 shot down a Russian aircraft in Syria. The Russian reaction was very swift and very harsh, and the Turks had to basically apologize. And of course, as usual, they blame somebody else. In this case, they blame crews that were supposedly Gulenists who shot down the aircraft. But maybe at that point in time, during those negotiations, maybe the Russians said, you know what, one of the things we want you to do is to buy the S-400s. And for Putin, I think your concerns about the transfer of Russian technology to a NATO country is a good one. But in some ways, I would argue that for Putin, it's a no-lose situation. Why is it no-lose? First of all, this is the best advertisement for the S-400s that you can imagine. Having a NATO country buys S-400s. I mean, imagine, I can see Russian literature we're saying buy S-400s. Even Erdogan thinks they're the best missile system, and Erdogan is a member of the NATO alliance, right? That's one. Number two, so you get $2.4 billion, I mean, in the process, right? And number two is, of course, for Putin, it's a way of putting a kind of manipulating, if you want, the American-Turkish relationship, because clearly that has created a problem in the relationship. And he's sitting in Moscow and laughing at this and saying, thanks, because of my sale to the Turks, now the Americans may impose sanctions on Turkey, right? U.S. is going to impose sanctions on a NATO country, right? And this is going to come about because the Russians managed to sell these S-400 missiles. I mean, and from that perspective, I think the risk of losing some of the intelligence of the S-400, so to say, secrets, is not that risky. Besides, the United States and the NATO alliance have had access to the S-300s since 1998, and so they know quite a bit about I'm sure, about the S-400s. Do you want me to shift to Erdogan?
Not yet. I would like to add one question. Do we know, or do you know, who was actually the main promoter of buying this? Because we have a strategic school inside Turkey, not from Erdogan's camp, but from the nationalists, who took over a lot of the Eurasian rhetoric or thinking of the Russian school. Even it goes back very long, even to Ibrahim Bey Gasparali and all those. It is basically a bedrock of Turkish nationalism, of the pan-Turkish nationalism side of it, not the Ottoman side of it. And do you think that this school had any impact? Because Erdogan is now for years in a coalition with the MHP, where these people have their natural ideological and organizational home, using the MHP also to get access to strategic advisory position, etc. And or do you think that the decision back then has been already taken more around a very inner circle, void of ideological thinking?
I think you're making an important point, but as you were asking the question, I had already in my mind to answer you by saying option two, even before hearing what your option two was, i.e. this was a decision made by the inner circle around Erdogan. And in fact, that once Erdogan decides on something, I don't think there is anybody in the inner circle who has the courage to say, Mr. President, I think this is a mistake. This is going to create problems for us in the future with the Americans, with NATO, because everybody defers to him. I mean, and you see that anybody who criticizes Erdogan, even remotely, gets punished. I mean, this week we've had two senior, and also Aslan, Ismail Aslan, two people who have been with Erdogan for decades, right? For being with Erdogan from the beginning, were just kicked, and just because they said things that he did not like. It's not that they went against him; they just criticized a little aspect of his. So the reason I don't believe in the first part or your first hypothesis is because Erdogan is so sure of himself, so confident, and yet he can manipulate the Eurasian folks. Now, the relationship with MHP is slightly different. The relationship with MHP is one in which he now depends a great deal on Bahçeli because he doesn't have a majority on his own in parliament. So he needs, even though this is a presidential system, but there is something to be said about parliament, at least as an image. So the MHP is pushing him, but the MHP is not a party or an organization that has been pro-Russian. I mean, in fact, they think that the Russians, they've always been against the Soviet Union. They think the Russians usurp Turkish territory, Turkish people who live in, right? So there is no love lost between the nationalists and the Russians, right? So the Eurasianist bloc is, I think, a little bit smaller. We should not put MHP in that group, right? So that brings us back to, I agree with you completely that it is really his decision and the inner circle that agrees with everything he says.
But then, could you walk us a little bit through the career of Erdogan, where you would put the decisions or developments where he then became the person he is now, creating the system, admittedly, if you look especially to an Erdogan of 2005 in Diyarbakir to nowadays, this is an incredible sad shift and sad turn. And perhaps if you have one remarks or two about how far did we Westerners, but especially Europeans, co-create this Mr. Erdogan by, I don't know, some say because we dashed Turkish accession hopes to the European Union too early and the style was bad, other disregarded. But if you could feature this in a little bit.
Look, this is a great question. I mean, yes, Erdogan, when he became mayor, especially when he became prime minister in 2003, was greeted by everybody. Forget about the foreigners, the Europeans, the Americans, etc., or the Middle Easterners, but by the pro-democracy groups in Turkey, right? As he is finally a leader who is going to bring democracy to Turkey, right? He was a man of the people. He ran Istanbul really well, right? He genuine manager, and also somebody who was espousing, shall we say, ideas that are in line with democratic principles. Whether this was an act and that he always intended to change, I don't know. There are signs when you look at the early parts of his prime ministership where he talked about issues in such a way that contradicted maybe a little bit his democratic, or shall we say, certainly the principles of a secular Turkey. But I would argue that at the beginning, he had no other choice. And he was very smart about this. It's not that he became prime minister and tried to live within the guardrails of the Turkish military, which until then was still the most important political institution in Turkey. And I say political, underlying the word political. And so, look, the Turkish military has intervened already 4 times. If you are a Turkish leader, you every night when you go to bed, you must think that maybe in the morning when I wake up, there's going to be a tank facing my house, my residence, right? Because this is how the Turkish military has resolved the problems in the past. So, in order to inoculate himself against the Turkish military, right? What he did was to adopt by essentially creating this alliance system outside of Turkey that protected him from the military. So as long as he became the darling of the West, the military was not going to touch him. And this was brilliant until, and I don't know if he foresaw that, until the military made a terrible political mistake because they also were too self-confident. You will remember in 2007, the Abdullah Gül, who was the deputy prime minister and one of the leaders of the AKP, was pushed as the candidate for the presidency. The military said, no way, right? And why did they say no? Because Abdullah Gül's wife has a headscarf, and the notion that a woman with a headscarf would live in the same house that Atatürk built was totally unimaginable for the Turkish military. So they threatened, and he called their bluff. He went for elections, right? And he had received, the AKP had gotten 34% in 2002. In 2007 in elections, they got 46%. Yes. Right? It was a complete repudiation of the military. Right? The military suffered one of its biggest defeats, but that allowed Erdogan the ability to start shifting. Right? He became very self-confident. He didn't have to worry anymore at night whether or not the military would intervene, right? And you see both in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy changes, right? Good changes and bad changes. We saw in 2009 the famous Davos incident with Shimon Peres, right? Something he probably would not have done before 2007. Right? Remember, he comes from a very conspiratorial background. Right? He is, after all, Erbakan's protege. Right? Even if he broke with Erbakan, the person who created the Islamic movement in Turkey, right? All of these people were always very fearful of the West and especially of the United States. Right? So you didn't cross the United States that easily, right? Because the repercussions, but the instrument of the United States in their mind was always the military. Things have changed in the sense that Erdogan is much more self-confident. And in terms of your question, whether or not he always intended to, I think the answer is yes, but yes, in the sense that that's what he wanted. I mean, he has a vision. Unlike most leaders, Erdogan has a vision for himself and for Turkey. The two are completely tied to each other. Turkey becomes important, so does Erdogan, right? I mean, he pushes kind of Turkey as a means to also aggrandize himself and put himself in history books, which he has already, for better or for worse. But he could not have calculated that he would be this successful, right? It isn't until 2007, when the confrontation with the military took place, that he realized that the doors are now open, that he can do anything he wants. And you see slowly the shift.
Puzzling when you saw the first footage in Turkish TV when Erdogan comes back. Well, people are waiting. It takes hours before he lands. So people are waiting at the airport. Now, what you would find was from their groups which were ideologically totally opposed, I found the symbols, the last of the 1970s organizations. I think I remember even the DHKPG flags, which is a left-wing terror organization, anti-imperialists, some luminaries from the 68 generations, and a lot of Islamists of various branches, which I always thought I will never see in Turkey, but here they were. And this was also something which I which you mentioned before, this attitude to say that the United Nations is not a fair organization because they're only the permanent five. Well, any Iranian student would say that because it's the doctrine there. And it's about this. Over years, how would we not see this classic, very strong anti-imperialist trend or identity going through, because Erdogan never denied it. You just had to listen carefully. Was this wishful thinking on our behalf? And it's had deep roots. It has deep roots in the Islamic side. It has deep roots with the right, political right, including MHP people. All this suspicious attitude and so on. I think when you said before, the popularity of Erdogan, he was really halkçı in the Turkish term. But this must have to do with a certain anti-imperialist or whatever you call it. So with him coming with this attitude so blatant and so openly to power and to the presidency, do you think that anti or critique on Erdogan also will imply critique on these ideological stances, which because they have so deep roots? Or would another one be somebody, or if replaced, would this be something that we have to live with, that somewhere in the closet you have a strong anti-imperialist identity of Turkey?
You do. There is always, there has always been an anti-imperialist component to, shall we say, Turkish identity, etc. In part because they were an imperial power. I mean, let's not forget that. They are the ones who for 600 years ruled enormous amount of territory. And but that when it comes to that, of course, it's amnesia, because the Ottoman Empire, it was the perfect empire that did everything perfectly, right, except for lost to the West, to the imperial powers. So that kind of de-emphasizes, shall we say, the imperial nature of the Ottoman Empire. But I digress. What is very important to understand today, I think, is that when you look at Erdogan's discourse, whether on its own interest rates, because there is this foreign interest rate lobby, or the US, or the Europeans, the way he addresses attacks the likes of Macron or any other leader, kind of dismisses them. But this is in part because he has been in power for 18 years.
Yeah.
So anything that happens today, whether it's COVID or the economic issues, it's his responsibility. He cannot blame his predecessors, right? So what do you do in that situation? You blame the outsiders, right? And the outsiders then become essentially a very convenient foil, but at the same time, right, it does engender, or it strengthens, if you want, the quote-unquote anti-imperialist sentiment in Turkey. But what what I would argue here is this anti-imperialist sentiment in Turkey is a little bit like the populists or the Trump supporters in the United States. I mean, it is a little bit manufactured. It doesn't mean that it's not real. It doesn't mean that it's not long-lasting, but it is manufactured and being manipulated very carefully by Erdogan. That's his only, shall we say, and the Kurds, of course. Now he's using the Kurds for the very simple reason, for the exact same reason, i.e. by delegitimizing, by making them the enemy, he has another group to, in addition to the West, to attack. He never says anything like this with respect to the Russians or any other country, right? It's always in that sense, you picking the right terminology, even if it's a false one, anti-imperialism, right? And but I think that's an excuse, because fundamentally, fundamentally, if you think about Erdogan, Erdogan is very much a businessman.
Yeah.
I mean, he comes from that tradition. I mean, Islamic, yes, but successful. I mean, he really cares about business, always did, right? And part of Turkey's economic success came precisely because it could export to the United States, but especially to Europe, right? Without Europe, the Turkish economic miracle, so to say, would not exist.
Without Europe, yeah.
Right? And this is a contradiction in some ways in the discourse of this anti-imperialism discourse. Yes, you're against them, but when the Turks want to travel, where do they go? They go to Europe, right? They don't go to Egypt, they don't go to Iran, they don't go to Saudi Arabia, they don't even go to India and places like that. Most of them want to go to Europe. So there is this fundamental, it's a little bit, maybe there's a inferiority complex a little bit involved here, especially I think Erdogan feels that because he continuously compares himself and keeps saying that Turkey and Turkish civilization and Turkish human rights policy and Turkish everything is superior to Western forms, right? There's this constant. I mean, do you see a German leader or a French leader saying what we do in terms of human rights or democracy is so much better than the rest of the world, or you know, you don't have. I mean, it's a question of maturity a little bit, but you're right. I mean, there is this fundamental, should we say, anti-imperialist discourse that is now strengthened by Erdogan's rhetoric, and it's going to continue because he needs it.
Good. We are very close towards the end, but I think you mentioned it already, and it must not go unnoticed, and we have to put the focus on it. That is the Kurdish question, the Kurdish issue, however you call it. What would how much will the Kurdish issue inside Turkey, because we saw under Erdogan big developments and great progress, inside Turkey be touched upon? What do you think? And then, of course, the relationship with northern Iraq seems to be less problematic. Even Turkey cooperates with the KRG, but it is with PYD, or what is called the PKK branch of Syria. How will this conundrum be tackled with?
It's a great question, Walter. I am not very confident that the Biden administration will take this issue within Turkey front and center, right? It is one of the number of issues that the United States has with Turkey. But as you pointed out, it's a strategic issue. It's something that can be pushed down the road, whereas a confrontation between Greece and Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean is far more vital, far more immediate in terms of repercussions. Similarly, the S-400s is far more immediate because you have to solve this problem, because so much depends now on how the S-400 will be solved. And by the way, I've tried very much to think of a solution to the S-400. So far, I have not. I mean, I've read some commentary, but it really doesn't make sense in terms of solving the problem. So I don't think, from that perspective, that the Americans are going to do much. The one thing that people are talking about, but this is in general, to reorganize. I mean, you may remember Madeleine Albright had started something called the Community of Democracies. There is actually an organization, it turns out, which is based in Warsaw, but from what I can tell, hasn't done a thing in many, many, many years. But there is talk now of creating kind of an alliance of democracies, come up with some kind of institutional structure to which Turks will not be invited, right? So that's one way of, shall we say, putting down the Turks and saying, look, yes, you're a member of NATO, yes, you want to be a member of EU, yes, you're an important country, but you're not in democracy. And that, I think, will be a very important measure. But that will not change Erdogan's calculation with respect to the Kurds. For Erdogan, the Kurdish question, even when he took enormous and brave positions in terms of resolving it, it was always instrumental. It was because he thought that the Kurdish question had to be solved. Otherwise, Turkey's advancement along many lines, many avenues would be blocked. That he understood. But he thought that his approach to the Kurds would mean that the Kurds would accept his terms, and that is to say that they would not ask for anything political. That they will only ask for cultural rights. Right. So you can have Kurdish schools, you can have, municipalities do business in Kurdish, kind of have a little bit of, but never political, right? But when he realized that the Kurds wanted more, not independence, not separation, but political rights, and that became crystallized when HDP became so powerful as a political party, right? That he turned around and, of course, with what happened in Syria, and I'll come to that in a minute, he turned against the Kurdish question. And now, what I fear is that he's going to ban the Kurdish party, the HDP, and go for elections. Because HDP is the one party that essentially prevents him from assuming a majority in parliament. He lost Istanbul because of HDP. And HDP, being the third largest party, means it has actually more members of parliament than the MHP, right? And so it's a bulwark against Erdogan getting a majority in parliament. So if he bans a party, then he thinks he's going to get a majority, right? So that is where
the Kurdish votes would get lost, because it's very hard to imagine that they go for the CHP, especially in the traditional Kurdish areas. Yeah. Well, that's an old game, an old trick.
Right, exactly. But so how the United States would engage, if HDP is banned, sure, there'll be all kinds of criticisms. I don't think there will be any serious action in the term of sanctions or something like that, because we already are going to impose sanctions on Turkey because of the question of the S-400s. But the issue where this will come to kind of a decision point is in Syria. Right? Tony Blinken and Biden and all the people around Biden criticized very much Trump's decision to pull out American troops from Syria and allow the Turks to invade northern Syria. And in fact, commit atrocities. I mean, they did ethnic cleansing in Afrin, in places like that. They kicked out all the Kurds and brought other people in there. I mean, really, for a NATO country to do all this is really unacceptable. Trump shielded Turkey from all these things. So will the United States increase the number of troops in Syria? Will the United States start pushing the Turks to say, you have to get out of northern Syria? I think it depends on a little bit what the Turks do. There is talk now that Erdogan may try to do another intervention in Syria before Trump leaves. I think that will be a horrible mistake, because it will poison the relationship with the Biden administration in ways in which we've never seen before, because it will be seen as taking advantage of the interregnum. But clearly, the situation in northern Syria is not sustainable. There aren't enough Syrian Kurdish troops, because they've suffered great casualties, not just against ISIS, but also against Turkey. There are these huge prisons that they control that, we've seen continuously breakouts from those prisons, because it's impossible to have, I think Al-Khor has 40,000 detainees in there. I mean, they need help. Right? And I suspect one of the things that the Biden administration will want to do is, at the very least, help the Syrian Kurds. Right? In what shape, form that takes, I don't know. It may mean sending surreptitiously, maybe, more American troops, and also give money, try to alleviate some of the burden that the Kurds have. It has to be done, because you don't want ISIS to come back. I mean, the United States and the allies have, and the people in the region have suffered enough and spent enough on defeating ISIS. Why do you want them to reemerge? Because this is like a cancer. You know, you stop the treatment, they'll come back. And so I suspect that on that issue, there will be some movement, and that will also anger Erdogan, but kind of to put a final point to all of this, the trick for Biden is to be able to say no to Erdogan. Right? You say no to Erdogan once, and you say it again, and you say it again. Only then you will see that he will start changing and rethinking his policies. It's not just one no that will be sufficient. You'll have to say no to him on a whole series of things, because Erdogan's strategy is always one step backwards, two steps forwards, right? You make tactical concessions, but then you push. Look what's happening in Cyprus now with the two-state solution that he's pushing now. It's new. I mean, again, just when there is, he's confronting issues with the United States and Europe, he doubles down, right? Because that increases the stakes, and you have to negotiate with him no longer in the previous with the previous parameters, now with the new parameters that he has created.
Yes.
Right? So this is a case in Eastern Med. It's a case with the EEZ. It's a case with Libya, and now with Cyprus. So at some point, I think the trick will be for Biden to say no, and I mean no. There will be no negotiations on this. You won't be able to. Yes, you're important, but Turkey is important more than your policies.
Perhaps as a very final roundup, when you go back to the broader picture of the Biden administrations, we have dealt with in detail also with the Turkey aspect. Is it too facile to say that the US are now really re-engaging in the Middle East, because in a way the US was always there, and there will be a set of new ideas to be expected? Or is it, are those right who think that this will be some kind of restart of Obama politics?
Look, I don't pretend to know what it is the new incoming administration is thinking about the Middle East. But I suspect that if there is going to be a new policy, Biden policy on the Middle East, right, and you do have a fairly important, strong foreign policy team in place, it will not come immediately. Don't look for the signs now. Look for signs in a year or maybe even 2 years from now. Once they settle, they have to basically, it's like there are many fires ongoing at the moment, and they have to essentially extinguish the fires before they start thinking about the big picture of why do we have so many fires, right? Or why do we have so many problems? So they have to essentially try to first of all fulfill some of the expectations that people have of them in terms of international institutions, etc. And especially on the economic side, but also if you are going to come up with new ideas, they take time. We've tried so many things in the Middle East, right? Now you're talking about the UAE, Israel, Greece axis, so to say, which is being formed essentially as which its common purpose here is being anti-Turkish. Right. So Erdogan has one thing he has succeeded. He has, he wanted to change the status quo. He did change the status quo in the Middle East, but not necessarily in the way he may have wanted to. Right. And now there is people are sufficiently concerned that they are aligning themselves against Turkey. So if you have a changed Middle East, then you need to come up with new ideas. The old ideas, whether it's Obama ideas or X ideas, Y ideas, not going to work. But you have to give time to the administration to think these things through, right? They've been out of power for a while, and the president, the outgoing president, has been, as we know, not only uncooperative, but has not really had serious thoughts about what to do about except his own personal preferences. And you have this gap, if you want, that they have to essentially come to grips with. They have to understand what happened, right? And I suspect, there will be my old office at the State Department. I used to work there for a little while. Policy planning should become a very active place where that's the place where you need to think through some ideas and push them up the chain of command and say, look, here are the options we should think about. And I really do not think that I'm not expecting revolutionary policy changes, but I do expect that there will be new approaches.
Yeah, Henri, thank you so much for this outlook. And I totally agree. We could talk an hour more only about the United Arab Emirates, which is a very impressive player. Perhaps it's another possibility. I thank you so much. All the best. Stay healthy, stay away from COVID and all the other best meetings to Washington.
Thank you.